Hi, folks. We're just going to give a couple of seconds for people to get on. Also, hopefully for the sirens to stop going by the window where I'm doing this. Thanks for joining us. It's going to be a good discussion. We'll get started in 60 seconds or less. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dara Lind. I'm a senior fellow at the American Immigration Council. I'm going to be moderating today's webinar, Transparency in Tumultuous Times, How Journalists and Advocates Can Leverage the Power of Sunshine Laws to Effect Change. I'm joined by, as you can see, my colleague Raul Pinto, the Deputy Legal Director for Transparency here at the Council, and Ellen Goodrich, the Jack Nelson Dow Jones Legal Fellow at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. I'm going to really step aside and let the two of them share their expertise, hard-won wisdom, working in the trenches of, immigration, journalism, and transparency. For all of you, we're going to have some Q&A at the end. If you've been on a Zoom webinar before, you know that you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. We'll select some of those to either incorporate into our discussion as we go or to address at the end. I don't need to tell you why this is super important, but I'm going to anyway, because I think we've really seen over the last few days alone just how opaque government can be without intervention, and how important and how much change it can affect when there is any visibility into what's going on. Over the weekend, the Trump administration announced that the day before it had signed a proclamation that designated all Venezuelan men over a certain age who the Trump administration said were members of a criminal gang in Venezuela for summary deportation. Over the course of the weekend, a combination of litigators, on-the-ground lawyers, advocates, and family members of people who had themselves been deported discovered that the government had been extremely had raised serious questions about the extent to which the government was even complying with court orders, about any process whatsoever for those who had been designated. And we've seen over the last several days alone some profiles already coming out of people who were caught up in this. Some of this is due to some very traditional shoe leather journalism. Some of it is due to information being shared among people who are in the position to affect change. We're now going to look at some of the more systematic ways that journalists and advocates can work through this, things that aren't as reliant on having, the right person on the phone or the right lawyer in the right detention center, but things that can allow us to get a more systematic view of the system. And so, I want to kind of ask Raul and Ellen, in each of your views, what's the relationship between government transparency, freedom of the press, and a functioning and robust democracy? How do those three work together?
Raul, you want to go first?
Sure, I can get us started. I think that we're in Sunshine Week, and this is a commemoration of how organizations have fought for the public's access to information. And in our particular context, in our particular work, right, it's so important to know what agencies are doing, and that is half the battle. We want to know exactly what procedures, what processes, how individuals, as Dara pointed out before, what are the procedures that are being followed by the agencies in order to actually put folks into removal proceedings, sometimes without due process, as we saw this weekend. And so I think that aspect of transparency, that work in transparency that so many advocates do, so many organizations that have been in the oversight world and the watchdog world, as we call it, it's just so important for a functioning democracy. And so I think that to me is one of the main takeaways. Before I pass it over to Ellen, I will also point out that transparency is particularly important in the immigration world because it is the main avenue by which individuals get their records when they are trying to fight off a deportation in immigration court. And that, very unfortunately, has swelled up the numbers of requests that are open with Department of Homeland Security because really it's the only way in which an immigration attorney can get a full history of their client's immigration. That then allows us to make the assessment of, well, this particular immigration and removal defense may work. No, you don't have the circumstances for this other particular defense to work. Hey, in this particular case, we may actually have to just take an order of removal because the circumstances for establishing a defense are not there. And so that aspect of transparency is particularly important for establishing a right to counsel, for establishing due process, for establishing individuals' rights to be heard and their processes to be fair. And so to me, I think we can never forget that that's also an aspect of transparency. Now, whether it should be there or not, we can have that debate, and I'm sure we will, right? Like, is there a better way? You know, if you're facing charges in criminal court, right, the government is obligated to provide you with the evidence that they have, and they can't just, you know, bring it on, put it on top of you the day of the trial, right? If there are any, you know, immigration attorneys on the in the audience, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about there, right? So we can't ignore the fact though that is right now a part of the process, and in order for that part of the process to work well, the other parts have to work well too.
Yeah, and to add on to that, kind of like a broader view, I think, the point of the Freedom of Information laws is so you can like know what the government's up to. And without those laws, we have to rely on other people. I think right now there's a lot of distrust in the media, but it's really hard to counter what the media is telling you when they're giving you the documents and saying, no, look, like this is what your government officials were doing. And I think when the media is able to use those effectively, it can lead to really positive change. So an example of that is like the civilian casualty files that we helped Asma Khan, who's a reporter with the New York Times, do. And like her research found that in these drone strikes, like 62% of them were killing or injuring children. And like that was a government secret before this FOIA litigation and these records were able to come out. And then it actually led to policy change. So I think, they having access to these records can help keep your government accountable and make sure that the public knows what they're up to.
Ellen, can I just jump in to say that is exactly what I think the model should be, right? Journalists, advocates working together in order to affect change. One example that I can also pitch in with is, how the family separation reporting based on FOIA requests and based on requests for information and journalists going through their sources really put together a picture of what was going on during the zero tolerance policy era during the first Trump administration. That's just an example within our ambit of immigration law that where the system sort of worked, and the end result was that the zero tolerance policy was sort of ended shortly after the public outcry, right? And so again, like that's the importance of a good democracy, and informed citizenry is extremely crucial for impacting change.
Thanks to both of you. And I mean, the problem, of course, with everything you're saying is that there are only so many of us and we only have so much time, right? And, especially in a period like the one we're in right now, where, there is so much going on so many fronts. And with the Freedom of Information laws being a tool that, isn't that works best in particular settings and for particular purposes, but that does have a certain amount of time lag associated with it. Like one of the real strategic questions facing us is like, how do we best focus our efforts to get the most bang for our buck? So first of all, that like requires a certain amount of being able to kind of shut out some of the noise that's happening and be able to predict what's going to still matter 6 months, a year, even, if the government's really dragging its feet a couple of years from now. But like, even once you've decided that something ideally is going to be important enough that we'd like to have some records on it, how do you craft a FOIA request to maximize the chances of a positive outcome? Do you target information that you know exists? Do you craft an exploratory FOIA in the hopes that you can find something out that you don't already know?
I'm gonna give the most lawyer answer of all time. It depends. So I think, a targeted request where you know a document exists, or like, say you were looking for a specific individual's like A file, and like that exists. That can be really beneficial. They can get back to you a lot faster. You're able to give a much more narrowed approach. But a lot of times, journalists are seeking information where maybe they don't um, know exactly what they're looking for or exactly what kind of documentation exists. So the advice I always give is like be willing to narrow the scope of your request throughout the process, throughout working with the agencies, and be open to having these conversations with the agencies. And maybe, you were looking for documentation for the past 10 years, and you've narrowed it maybe to the past 2 years instead. So I feel like if you're going to go for an exploratory request, be open to narrowing it down and finding a more tailored version of that request, because you could be waiting years and years before you get documents otherwise. Oh, another thing, ask for rolling productions. So, as the documents become available, if you put this in your request, then hopefully you will get sent them as they are prepared instead of a huge batch of documents in 3 years or whatever.
That is super helpful, because that's this you mentioned, Ellen, a couple of strategies that we're sort of leaning into as we get file more and more requests, particularly when it comes to data as well. We all know sort of the importance of requesting data so that you can show what the impact of an individual policy is. And so I think your tips are great in that regard. I will say that sort of we're sort of strategizing how we get better at narrowing our requests. Your tip about dates is very, very true. One of the things that I think requesters often sort of need to put themselves into the shoes of that first line of agency review a little bit, and really ask, hey, do I know what I'm looking for here? Like, where are you sending me in order for me to find documents that are responsive? Yes, some agencies are obstructionists, and they will try their best to kind of put roadblocks to the documents that you're seeking. But for the most part, I think there are some, put it that way, more mildly, there are some folks that really do want to help and really do want to get to the bottom of the documents that you are seeking. But if it's not crafted in a way that it's specific enough for that first line of defense to kind of know what you're looking for, then I think it's going to become a little bit problematic. And then if you need to file a lawsuit afterwards, then it's going to be, you could actually be facing some obstacles when it comes to litigation as well, because obviously the courts are going to be very deferential to the government. Courts are going to be very, they're going to believe what the agency says about, hey, we're overly burdened. And particularly in this day and age, when you're seeing agency resources being depleted through the lens of government efficiency, one of the things that we're keeping an eye on, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, is what's going to happen to the FOIA units in departments that are being cut, and is that going to be a priority for agencies that are needing to prioritize different services? But yeah, your suggestions of narrowing is something that we all, I think, need to do, and looking at dates, providing the agencies with potential specific databases where we know that data exists, so that they can really go into that pond and try to get that information out of there. So yeah, I think that you're spot on with what you're talking about. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask Dara this question. It's like, how do you with your experience as a reporter, right, trying to figure out and trying to assess like what to report on, what to request, how did you handle that when you were reporting sort of in the more traditional sense of the word?
I mean, like I'm about to blow my cover to all like 89 of y'all on this call because I joke with Raoul that I was the world's worst FOIA requester when I was a reporter. I never got a successful FOIA request expedited or answered, but like I worked with some absolute FOIA stars. Yegana Torbati, who's at the Post now, was a colleague of mine at ProPublica and would routinely get documents that she had requested 2 years prior because she'd seen policies being developed in the early stages and requested correspondence between particular individuals in the government that were related to the policy being developed. And so by the time, for example, when the Trump administration's regulation on public charge, which sought to restrict legal immigration based on the likelihood that immigrants would use public benefits, when that was finalized, Yegana had just gotten a tranche of documents about how the Department of Veterans Affairs had reacted to early development of that regulation, and so could point out that there had been concerns about veterans benefits becoming a problem under the regulation. So it was really interesting to see how, things that might have seemed like a shot in the dark, when they got filed, were ultimately able to really contextualize a policy better. But Raul, I love that you like jumped to litigation because it kind of does sometimes seem like the inevitable second step in a FOIA process is that you have to put it into court. But like, for especially, not every journalist has an attorney attached at the hip to them that they can take into federal court to sue the government. So
Wait, what? You're kidding. Or big legal departments within their staff? No? It's not a
right.
thing?
I mean, the other ProPublica story that I'll tell is that at the beginning of the year, there was an annual like FOIA workshop that started with, if you think you're going to need to litigate this year, you got to tell us right now because there's only so many of us and everybody is filing FOIA requests here. But so Ellen, how in your experience, like, do reporters and should reporters be thinking about when it doesn't seem like the request is being answered in a responsive fashion, when to take them to court?
So the answer, like, it's so resource based. Unfortunately, like, do you have an attorney attached to your hip? Like, do you have that available to you? I would say is like always the main factor because agencies delay all the time. Like, and it's the unfortunate reality that the way to speed it up is to go to court. But all the other considerations are, do you have a tight deadline that you're working on? Because like we said, it can take years. Like, do you have that freedom and the flexibility, or do you need something right now? How important are the records to the story? Do you think you're able to tell a complete story without them? Um, Also, like, if you got a denial, how strong is your belief that the records exist? Or how strong is your belief that the denial was improper? Um, like, we've had ones where the agency was like, that record doesn't exist. And we got to be like, here you are giving it to someone else. Give it to us too. And so, like, when you have that kind of information going into an appeal, you're feeling very confident. But if you're just taking a shot in the dark and you don't have that information to support your conclusion, maybe you're not gonna try litigation. But Dara, I'd be interested to hear like about your experience and when you decided, even though it sounds like you weren't the most successful FOIA.
Yeah, I was terrible at it because, and like this is actually something where immigration is a real like immigration is a very hard issue uh compared to other areas where investigative journalists could do FOIA requests because it has a really many of the agencies and components that we'd be looking at are law enforcement agencies. And there is a law enforcement exemption to FOIA that is pretty broad. And so between that and concerns about, personal information being used as, either justifiably or overcautiously or as a smokescreen, the ability to identify what kind of document you're going to see that is going to reflect policy on the ground that isn't so operational that they're going to be able to exempt it from you is actually very difficult. And so the only thing that I really had any success with was trying to get things that had been, kind of like you're saying, like reported as documents. Like, okay, I when immigration courts started showing a video to people who didn't have lawyers, introducing them to the immigration court, it's very easy to say, hey, we should have a copy of that video. We should have a copy of whatever like materials you're providing internally to judges, telling them about when to show. So that's very straightforward, but like it also put a pretty low ceiling, on the ability to do certainly any kind of real time anything. But the other problem with doing this in the immigration space is that it can be it can it can be difficult, and this is, or I guess this is not actually an immigration specific problem, but like it can sometimes be difficult to draw the connection between the documents you're seeing and the systemic scope of them and like what is going to make people who aren't FOIA and government transparency nerds care about it. And so, how do each of you from your particular perspectives, when you're both crafting the request itself and then working from the materials, how do you use the documents, in service of something that will get public attention without sacrificing the kind of systemic scope?
I'll defer to Ellen to go first on this, but let me touch back on a second and go back for a second to something you said that connects very well with what Ellen was saying, Dara, which connects with the litigation versus the assessment of the resources, which is that oftentimes as you're crafting the request, you are actually trying to anticipate also, hey, this document may have some law enforcement implications, and I may not need to ask for it because I'm going to get it blocked anyways, and I know I'm not going to go to the mats for it and litigate over it, right? Or if you've included it as a part of the request and as a part of the productions that the government has given you, you may want to make that assessment at that point and say, hey, I'm not going to go after this document because otherwise it's just going to be a waste of time and therefore a waste of my resources. I just wanted to make sure to highlight that because I think it also goes into how you craft the request. So I apologize for kind of interrupting, but because I love to hear Ellen's take on the on how do you make it matter? Because I'm looking for ideas, to be perfectly honest.
I mean, in journalism, I think you make it matter through the stories you're telling. People don't care about the documents really, they care about the individuals involved. Like, I feel like some of the best reporting is, a systemic issue. It's reporting on a systemic issue, but throughout the reporting, you get to know an individual or see how the systemic issue is directly impacting a specific person. I think that's what makes people care. Like, just if I was to like make a website and just publish the documents, people would be like, okay, like I don't think they would really engage with it. But it's through that storytelling and through like the emotional part of it. I mean, especially like with immigration reporting, I think a lot of times telling about how these systemic things are impacting specific individuals is the way to make people care. But curious to hear other thoughts.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that attaching stories is crucial to making people care about the issue. I think that's also true of numbers. Data analysis. Data analysis is also has also become we've become just like numb almost to facts and numbers. I will say though that the council has really I think in the last couple of years since we merged with New American Economy, just done a fantastic job with data visualizations, which have become very popular, and people then engage with the data in a different way. And because we often based some of those findings in just FOIA requests that have been solely for data, it's a little harder to connect them with individuals. And so I think that having that aspect of interactivity where individuals can go into the website and not to be lackadaisical about it, but play around with the data and move things around and becoming didactic with the information, I think that sort of is a draw. This is a topic that has come up in different discussions in different settings because it goes to the heart of whether you want someone's information. And it's always the tussle that I have with reporters, right? Because reporters are going to be are very much into the practice of asking the attorneys, hey, do you know someone who's been directly impacted by the report that you just came out? And me, I put on my, my immigration lawyer hat, my lawyer hat on, and I'm like, no, because I don't want you talking to my client. Like I don't want to expose my client to have them say something that may be used against them, because as we know, if you talk to a journalist, you're sort of waiving that sort of confidentiality if something comes out, and if it can be harmful to a case, then that's something that I don't want my client doing. And that's always that conflict, that's always that tension that I have. Ellen, I don't know if you, like, do you have any like ideas as to how to, and for Dara as well, from your time as a reporter, like how do you deal with that? Because that was one of the biggest challenges. We love to put a face to the story, and sometimes that works. Like we've done it anonymously, right? Like if we have a story that has come out and we can protect people's identity through fictitious names or whatnot. But I'd love to hear your all's thoughts about that too.
I will pass to Dara because I've never actually worked professionally as a reporter, so studied it but did not do it. So I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I do think that this is something where traditional newsrooms have a little bit to learn from other ways that advocates that we've seen that transparency focused nonprofits have done a much better job of balancing the need to tell stories with the need to protect individuals. And no one has said, well, we don't know that you're people, that you didn't just make people up, and so I think that having run into some problems, and having plenty of former colleagues who have run into problems because we had really compelling stories but the subjects didn't want their names, or were only willing to have their first names included. And newsroom standard practice is that you have to have a full name. The idea that the the application of transparency as a way to illuminate power, rather than as just kind of a box ticking, well, we can't trust any individual who doesn't give us their full name, is something that some newsrooms are better at understanding than others, to be fully honest with you. But I think that it's also true that no matter how many assurances you can give someone, they still may not be interested in, you know, either they're not comfortable speaking to a reporter because they're being asked to talk about things that are very difficult for them. They're just not a very talkative person, or frankly, they don't want to trust someone they don't know very well with the power of, you know, properly protecting their identity. So, you do have to, in addition to trying to find creative ways to tell individual stories, there is a certain extent to which that can't be the only genre. And some of the basic elements in storytelling, like conflict, or you know, irony, when when some of the people in the story know things and the rest don't, those are things you can actually discover through documents. The best example of an internal government document from the first Trump administration, which was not from a FOIA, it was from discovery in a lawsuit, was when, in the litigation over temporary protected status, the litigants discovered an email exchange where uh where a government employee had pointed out that the Trump political appointees had rewritten a report so that it read like one guy wrote most of the report, somebody came in, conked him over the head, dragged him away, and wrote the rest of the report. That kind of really good quote tells you something about there being this internal conflict in the government over this, which is really useful to telling the story about how something happened. So what would, you know, what can people, what are tips and tricks that you guys can share? What can non-journalists learn from the way that journalists have been able to get records from government agencies? What's kind of what are the tools that you would think of?
My big one is to submit your request both at this federal and local level. I think we often think of especially immigration as pretty exclusively federal, but as we're saying, ICE contracts with local police departments all the time, and the records of those police departments you can get through state public records requests. So just kind of taking a multi-tiered approach to trying to get records both from the federal agencies and the state agencies or local agencies, I think is a big thing that can help. Also, state agencies usually get records a lot faster than federal agencies, so it can be a way to get more information on a quicker timeline. That's my big one, is do a lot of requests to a lot of different agencies.
So basically, like FOIA everyone is what you're
Yeah.
saying. It's FOIA everyone. I will jump in with an experiences that I think people are seeing more and more, which is how they've been utilizing this really arcane and nebulous regulation within the immigration regulation world to actually block access through state local records. And I think journalists are going to be starting seeing that more. Advocates have certainly been seeing it for a while, and that is Regulation 8 CFR 236.6, and I'm going to get the lawyerly out and give you the exact citation to it. But in essence, what that regulation says is that no person will release records of someone who's being detained by a local entity or even a private prison, which is why sometimes you could, I'm sure reporters have done public records requests to Core Civic, to DO Group, who are private prisons, and the private prisons say, we can't release these records due to this particular regulation. I think there are ways to challenge it. There was a case about 3 years ago brought by the ACLU of Michigan that challenged it under a state law ground, because the state law says that you can't release state records, much like with the ones that you're talking about, Ellen, which were sort of like police records, even like medical records of the individual. In that particular case, it was actually a U.S. citizen who had been removed incorrectly by ICE. And so they filed this case. The council filed an amicus on that particular case, and it was actually decided by the Supreme Court of Michigan. And they said, our state law, so our Michigan state law prohibits the local entity from releasing records that are prohibited by federal law, quote unquote, federal law. But they said a regulation is not a law, it's a statute. And so therefore, Calhoun County, you are obligated to release these records. So therefore, this 236.6 regulation shouldn't apply. And so it's important for folks to understand what are the limits of that regulation and be ready to fight when it's actually thrown in people's faces and trying to block access to records. Because I think you're right, Ellen, in that the if you can peek behind the state curtain and see what transpired to actually get the person into the removal and ICE and deportation pipeline in our world, right? I think that's super important. Just to see how the arrest happened. When last year during Sunshine Week, we released a report about how ICE was detaining individuals. Well, actually, it was based on practices by Border Patrol in the Sandusky Bay area of Ohio. And you wouldn't believe the amount of cooperation that the council ran investigations with our partners at a local organization in Ohio called ABLE. And you wouldn't believe the amount of cooperation that you saw behind the scenes that you would not have been able to get through FOIA necessarily. But that state records requests were very helpful in sort of understanding the fact that Ohio State Highway Patrol was actually calling in Border Patrol to check on identities, even when someone had a driver's license from Maryland, and how they were trying to identify folks in that particular way, so that when the individual it showed that they didn't have any proper documentation to be in the country, because even though they had a driver's license, they may have been undocumented. They were still passing them on to Border Patrol for processing under immigration laws, right? And so getting into those impetus, into that motivation by local law enforcement agencies can be huge for transparency. And so, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you in the FOIA everyone, and then see what happens, and then get ready to fight once you start seeing some of those blocks. The other thing that we've been seeing in the past too, from the local perspective, is these contracts. these contracts between the local the local entities like the sheriff's office and what are called the intergovernmental agreements that allow for these local prisons to hold immigration detainees. And so, and the problem that you're seeing is that the amounts that are being charged to ICE and within the locality, because ultimately the contract ends up with a private prison company, those amounts are actually being obscured and blocked by an exemption to FOIA called the B4 exemption, which is for trade secrets. But how, and to me, that is such an important angle, because taxpayers need to know how much money is being spent on these facilities and on detaining individuals. And so, that's another kind of obstacle that we're seeing. And again, to your point, important to go to the mat in some of these issues and to really be ready to litigate them and fight for them.
So let's talk in particular about expedited processing of FOIA requests. What is it? How can you get it? Does this make it easier for journalists to get things than other members of the public? Ellen, help us out.
So expedited processing is something that you can request in your first FOIA. Like when you submit your FOIA request, you can request expedited processing. Practically, I am not sure it actually does anything until we get to like the litigation production rate stage. So like doesn't hurt to ask for it, but I think when it really comes into play is, so agencies will have these set processing rates, like, okay, we'll look at 500 pages a month during this ongoing litigation. And say you qualify for expedited processing, the standard rate is 500. Courts have said, okay, well, expedited processing, you need to get these records faster. We're going to give you 750 pages a month or something. So I think practically when it really starts to make a difference is in the litigation phase, when you are setting a processing order with the court. But basically what you have to do is explain that you're a news organization, that you'll be disseminating the information to the public, and that there's a public benefit and an urgency to inform. So once you kind of make your case in the request, the agency will then make a determination. You can appeal that determination if you want to, through the, at least in the federal government, the administrative appeals process. But yeah, I think practically the only time I've ever seen it really come into play is in the like actual litigation stage.
In the council, I think I've only seen one so far, which is actually related to detentions during the COVID era. And I think it's an example to kind of show you the urgency that you need to demonstrate to the court in order to get expedited processing and for the agency to kind of pay attention to it. If I'm not mistaken, like there's only a handful of expedited processing requests that are approved per year, despite the thousands of requests that are made to Department of Homeland Security in a yearly basis, and so they're very few and far between, very few and far between. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be trying, as Ellen is saying. Like, it can't get any worse, so you might as well file something and see, and see if the court will bite. But I do think that it does take some very severe circumstances to kind of show that you need this faster processing.
So, getting to the kind of tumultuous times part of the title of today's webinar. Raul, you mentioned this part of this in passing earlier, but what do you think do you see any unique challenges under the current administration or kind of challenges that have even like come up over the last few years that have made it particularly difficult to successfully ensure transparency and conduct FOIA requests? And what additional obstacles do you foresee happening in future?
How long do we have? 20 minutes? Is that can I scrunch all of my grievances into 20 minutes? I'll start with my biggest concern this far, and that is the weakening of the FOIA offices. And as I was saying before, I try to put myself a little bit on the shoes of a FOIA processor if I'm like reading the first glance, right? And a lot of these folks are civil servants. that have been doing this for quite a while, and some of them really care about transparency and really care about, you know, having a robust democracy and being part of that system. Whether you're, we can have the debate as to whether you're in the right part of the system or not, but that's neither here nor there, right? But if you take away those resources, particularly, for example, in agencies like ICE, right, where if you're taking away those resources and putting them all into enforcement, you're really then delaying, um, delaying, you know, how quickly, you know, the agencies are actually processing these requests. So, for example, and Ellen, back me up here. I mean, we've seen you know, processing requests when you have a large request for policies, right? And as Ellen was saying previously, where you get these rolling productions where you're talking about, you know, hey, we can only process 500 pages per month, and this is what you're going to get, right? But the request that you filed is a fairly big issue, and therefore it's going to take, you know, you're going to get thousands of pages. You know, your patience wears thin, and the litigation then drags on, and those are resources that you're going to need. And so the less resources that these offices have, the longer it takes for you to get these documents. So, you know, we were talking about the going rate right now, and I haven't seen any other cases, but across the country, I think my experience has been that it's not any more than 500 pages a month, and that both the agency and when you get to the litigation stage, the U.S. Attorney's Office are really hard pressed to give you any more than 500 pages per month. And if the resources for those offices are actually going down, then we're talking about, you know, potentially less than that. And again, the courts are very much willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the agency and say, hey, we're understaffed here. You know, this is an onslaught of requests, and this is a pretty big request, and so we just don't have the resources to do that. And it's like, well, yeah, but your resources actually are all going to enforcement, so you can't also have it both ways. So I think that, to me, is one of the biggest concerns. As far as litigation is concerned, I think, you know, how the administration and how Department of Justice is going to view attorneys' fees. As you all may know, and people in our audience know well, that FOIA actually entitles you to attorney's fees at the end of the litigation if you've gotten a positive result out of the litigation, and that helps, right? That helps, you know, grassroots groups that may be making these requests. That helps who otherwise would not be able to afford legal representation to fight for that information. You know. And organizations like ours, who do this on a frequent enough basis, and are making sure that the agencies are following the law, and that by the agency paying attorney's fees is part of the accountability process. And so I think that keeping an eye on what DOJ is doing relating to that, and how hard they fight on attorney's fees, is also sort of another trend that I'm looking at as well.
Yeah, and I think the gutting of the FOIA offices is definitely like the biggest concern that I have, especially because I believe it was the FBI, even prior to the current administration, had slashed their processing rate. So their standard rate is now just 250 pages a month. So when they did that before these agencies started getting gutted, it's going to be like, are we at like 50 pages a month, you know? And like, as Raul said, like, you want to, like, these are people trying to do their jobs, but they don't have the resources to do their jobs. Or, you know, the FOIA office is now one person who's responding to all of these requests and has to review all the documents and stuff. So I think that's my biggest worry about it, is just, it was already something that took so long and was such a lengthy process and required a lot of work from the agencies. And so now when you have so fewer resources going to that work, I just feel like it'll take years and years and years to ever get any records.
So I do want to remind folks that they can use the Q&A box to submit any questions that they have, and we will have a little bit of time to get to them. But while folks are doing that, I wanted to ask each of you, what do you see as strengths overall of FOIA as a tool to expose what the government is doing, and what would you change to help it better do that?
I would change it so I do not have a job and people did not have to go to litigation to get their records. That is my big thing. If I could be unemployed, that would be awesome. So yeah, I mean, that's like dream big. I wish agencies actually responded, like statutorily, they have 20 days to respond to your FOIA request, and that just rarely happens. So if I'm dreaming big and fixing everything, FOIA offices are filled with resources and responsive to requests. And I think the benefit of FOIA is, like I was saying earlier, like you get the exact documents, you get to know everything that's happening, or not everything that's happening, but you get to see direct primary sources on what the government is doing and how it operates and how they're conducting their day-to-day business. So I think it's just a really beneficial tool that maybe you wouldn't get if you were just conducting interviews with like individuals who are working there.
Um, I actually like litigation over FOIA requests. So, let's keep that going. Because I will say this, the Biden administration actually tried a system to have individuals be able to obtain their own records from immigration courts, basically something known as their records of proceedings, and you are able to do that electronically. The records of proceedings in immigration court are important. I think we posted on the chat some information about what the A file is, which is basically a individual's immigration history, but it's a little the record of proceedings is a little different because it relates to specifically what has happened in immigration court. In any event, the system worked fairly well, and attorneys are requesting that documents be sent electronically. But in certain situations, the FOIA works better because it has baked in levels of protection. Meaning that if I filed a request electronically for that record of proceeding, and I haven't heard back from the government within the time amount allotted by FOIA, I can take them to court and I can file that lawsuit and I can try to court to, to try to get that production. Whereas if it's outside that process, then I don't have an avenue to do that. I don't have an avenue to enforce that. And so I think, any kind of reform to the system should probably include levels of protection. Same thing with, like, how do you challenge redactions? How do you go after, some arbitrary material that the government has blocked from viewing because it's convenient? FOIA does that. FOIA provides you with very specific situations. Are they being used properly? Probably not, but not all the time, definitely, right? But in a lot of instances, they provide you with guidance as to what's supposed to happen in immigration court and how the agencies are going to have to prove that the exemption is warranted, right? So in those terms, I think that any solutions to that, I think, have to include some sort of protection for individual requesters who have met a wall and are not getting the information that they seek.
Thank you. So, I'm actually going to just lob you guys a question direct from the Q&A to start off. Beyond litigation, what actions can everyday individuals take to support and enhance the FOIA process?
That's a really good question. Ellen, do you have
This is what happens when I just toss stuff up without prepping you for it first.
That's a great question. I guess to support FOIA, I don't know. It's hard because, it's not like I struggle with that, like outside of like practicing law in the area, what can you do to actually make it better? But maybe working with your local governments to inform them about FOIA. I feel like a lot of times like small cities and local agencies just are really uninformed about FOIA. So, you might get a denial, but then if you respond to them with some case law showing, oh, here's why I'm entitled to that information. You can help inform these people who are maybe much less familiar with FOIA or your state's freedom of information law, about the process or about, how the exemptions work. That's my best idea. Roel, I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's difficult because sometimes it does take a certain level of expertise to kind of know exactly what is foiable, what is redactable, and so it's a hard question to answer. But I think Ellen's idea is good. I think also, like, if you are looking for a document, if you're looking for certain information, right, scour the agency's FOIA libraries. They have them. And you can look at whether documents that you're looking for, that have the answers that you're looking for, are in those libraries. Because one of the things that to me sort of it becomes a little difficult is when you have FOIA requests that need to be processed and are being filed for information that, as Ellen was saying before, either A, does not exist, or B, is already publicly out there, and you're really kind of clogging up the system. And that's something that to me can be difficult. I am by no means suggesting that people should not file FOIAs. That is not what the Deputy Legal Director of Transparency for the Council is saying. All I'm saying is that you do have to be careful as to, like, what happens when there are so many FOIA requests that the agency's resources are actually taken up in processing and responding to all those to other requests. But I think the FOIA libraries are a particularly good source of information that can answer some of your questions as well. And by the way, then don't forget that you can try to force the agency to push to push for and publish more information proactively and put more stuff into their FOIA libraries as well. That's another avenue of engagement, and you can engage with Congress and your representatives on that and how to strengthen that part of the law.
That's what I was just gonna add. Like at the state level, bills are introduced all the time that would change the state's Public Records Act. So maybe trying to engage with the legislature and trying to ensure that there's more access to transparency would be something that you could do.
Yeah, like New Jersey, right? Like New Jersey was in a year and a half ago or so try to implement a bill to try to limit, and Florida as well had some information specifically after Governor DeSantis had the transportation of migrants to Martha's Vineyard. They try to block access to some of the emails that he had sent in preparations for those flights, and so very very heads up about what is happening to sunshine laws within your state.
So let's talk about DOGE. Like how can you use FOIA to get transparency into a government when it's not even obviously clear who's making the decisions, and when those decisions are being made and often unmade so rapidly? Um, what challenges does this provide, and, like, is it still possible to use FOIA to go after the work of of a body like DOGE?
So the courts have held that, at least I think it's DDC, yeah, the District of Columbia has held that DOGE is subject to FOIA. They're basically operating like an agency. They tried to say they were like the executive office of the president and only giving the president advice. And the court's been like, okay, functionally, that's not how you're acting at all. So they have been held subject to FOIA. Then the question is, do they have a FOIA team? Is there, when you're sending a FOIA to DOGE, who gets it? Like, who's in charge of responding to it? And those are things that I think we're still trying to see play out with DOGE and an agency that functions like this. So yeah, the questions I have is like, who handles FOIA at DOGE? How many people have they assigned to handle these? I know there's a lot of campaigns to like flood DOGE with FOIA requests, but at the end of the day, like they might just ignore them. So I think that's one of like the kind of existential crisis of like, okay, what happens if you're just ignoring the FOIAs?
Well, and Ellen, I think that also brings up a good question that was actually discussed in that decision in the DDC, which is many, and this is, by the way, not only DOGE, but this is a trend with different with a lot of different agencies, is that you have now agency personnel communicating through end-to-end encrypted communications apps like Signal, for example. And does that actually create a foiable record? You know, if you are looking for a call log, right, with information about everyone who's called you, that's a foiable record. But I actually can't get the recording of a conversation that wasn't recorded, right? Like if you have a telephone conversation, then it doesn't, that's not necessarily foiable, right? Unless there's a written summary or something like that. Which then basically it's like, you know, if Signal doesn't create a foiable record and this is the way in which they're communicating, then this is going to be a gap in our laws. And relating it back to the question before, what can we do? You know, right? What can we do to be engaged in FOIA and improve FOIA? Let's figure out a way in which government officials can't actually communicate through Signal and not be accountable to the public, because that is democracy dies in darkness, and that is a dark spot in our democracy right now.
Pennsylvania has a hearing about that exact thing on Monday. So it's being discussed at state legislatures, I know.
I'm so glad that people who are not me brought up Signal, because I always feel like I don't want to burn people who, you know, because it does go both ways, right? Like if you think about the broader suite of transparency, if you think about, for example, like whistleblowers, Signal is an essential tool for whistleblowers. And at the same time, it, you know, a law that protects the privacy of more vulnerable people in government can also be used to shield accountability from more powerful people in government. And, you know, thinking through the tensions between, we want this neutral principle like privacy, like transparency, but at the same time, we understand that that affects different people differentially. That's a conversation that, like, frankly, you know, like there is a component for just writing the laws in a way that makes them harder to evade, but that's also something that, like, we as a community need to be figuring out, right? It goes back to what we were saying earlier about anonymity, that, like, at a certain point, these are conversations that we're having internally and that we're guided by our own ethics, in addition to being driven by a desire to make, you know, to make more information public. But that's why it's, like, so important to continue having these conversations, right? Because you know, as a former journalist, I have one reaction to the idea of government officials not being able to use, you know, Signal for purposes that can't be FOIA'd. But, you know, the folks who are doing the litigating have very different perspectives on that, and continuing to make sure that journalists and transparency advocates and members of the public who simply care about what their government is doing are all in the room having the conversation, is how we're going to ensure that these tools remain relevant and that we can get information that people actually need. And so with that, unless folks have final closing thoughts, which no one's coming off mute, so I'm going to assume you don't.
I was just going to say that I was in a meeting. I was in a meeting in December, and someone called, like, transparency and FOIA work the last beacon of light left in the immigration world for us. And I don't know if Ellen feels that same way, but it is a tool, and I think it's a tool that can be wielded with power to hold those who are in power accountable. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that folks should be utilizing FOIA in order to learn what the government is doing, and whether they're adhering even to their own policies.
Yes, I mean, well, it is Sunshine Week after all, so of course we'd have to have a bright spot. But thanks so much to both of you. Thanks to everyone for attending. If you are interested in the transparency work that the American Immigration Council does, we do have a transparency disclosures newsletter. But frankly, if you're interested in transparency work, there are, you know, think about other ways that you can remain engaged, that make sure that you're supporting local journalistic outlets that are engaging, that are doing this work. You know, make sure that if you yourself have litigation experience or law experience, and that's something that you want to be able to provide and support, or, you know, and make sure that you're continuing to follow and support the work of organizations like Ellen's that help provide some of this infrastructure. Thanks to all of you for listening, and I hope you have an excellent day.
Thank you all.